Welcome to the Constructive Thinking, a podcast of the Progressive Contractors Association of Canada. This episode was recorded on October 3, 2025. My name is Paul Jong, President and CEO of the Progressive Contractors Association of Canada, and I am delighted to welcome to the podcast the Honorable Tim McMillan. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you. Excited to have this conversation.
Fantastic. Well, let's begin by introducing our listenership to yourself. Why don't you give a bit of a sketch of your kind of political and industry background, Tim? Because you and I know each other well. We go back a ways. You've covered a lot of ground, not just geographically, but in terms of the different areas of occupation. So tell us what you've been up to for the past number of years.
So I'm a Saskatchewan guy, rural Saskatchewan. I had an oil field services company in cattle before I got elected in 2007 as part of Brad Wall's government. Served in that government for a little over 7 years and had a few portfolios, Crown Investment Corporation, maybe the most notable being Minister of Energy and Mines. In 2014, I got asked to take on the CEO role at the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, where we did policy regulatory on energy and was at the center of a lot of the debates around pipelines, around carbon policy, around investment in resources in Canada. And 3 years ago, left there and started a consulting firm called Garrison. We are largely focused on the resource sector. And again, the policy regulatory that makes investment in Canada possible.
Well, thanks for that explanation, Tim. And I think that the pivot on your both your political experience as a policy maker and also your experience at CAP, which is I think the time frame which I got to know you, where there were some common themes, not just with CAP, but other peer industry associations around the bigger policy levers that really resonated with PCA. As you know, and our members know, PCA has a fundamental thrust towards competitive construction policy. And we know that construction policy exists within a broader frame of industry regulation. And so it's really an honor to talk to you today, because I think you'll shed some light on some of the key issues that are kind of, well, they're not new. They've been around for a while. Some of them go back as many as close to 25 years or more. So let's dive in, Tim, to a few of these topics that are kind of circulating around. Some of them date back to, on a federal basis, to the Trudeau administration and the struggles that I would say the bigger we had with some of the ideological and executional framing of those policies. But those policies, I think to a complete degree, exist to this day. New Prime Minister Carney has, for example, not seen fit to roll back the provisions of Bill C-69 despite the court decision. I think we should talk about that. There are related things around the tanker ban. There's a carbon tax issue, which, probably for some Canadians is kind of hard to get their head around exactly what that means. And I think you've got a good capability of talking to that. And there's things that are even a bit more specific, like the Species at Risk Act. All these things combine, I think, for the industry, the oil and gas industry, but also particularly for the construction industry, with members who are deeply rooted in the oil and gas industry and the petrochemical industry, LNG sector, pipelines, to kind of shed a light on where we think or where you think some of these things are going. So let's dive in, Tim. Maybe I'll just talk, we don't have to talk politically here, but we can talk a bit more kind of observationally and analytically about what Carney seems to be up to. I mean, without again editorializing, Carney is a fellow who, prior to his prime ministership, held a number of positions, notably in Canada and internationally, to his credit. He wrote a book, I think it was called Values. I haven't read it, but my understanding is that it had a fair bit of kind of leanings towards a fundamental reset in the Western world with respect to climate change issues. And yet now, as our prime minister, he seems to be taking a different cut, not really talking about those topics too much. And some of us wonder, when are those themes going to come back? Are they still roosting in the background? So I'd love to hear your kind of thoughts about that. And then without maybe asking you to be too vague, begin to root those in. What does that dynamic mean where he has perhaps a more pragmatic posture now, but still an ideological frame sitting in the background? What does it mean for things like Bill C-60 not being repealed? Yet on the other hand, the fact that Carney has introduced this so-called nation building project, the major project office is being framed up as we speak. So there's almost like contradictions, Tim, that are happening. Like can you give us some thoughts about where you see that going?
For sure. And that's a pretty big swap. So let me take a shot at it, and I'm sure it'll lead to some more conversation. But I might just round this as you did. The construction industry and PPA members specifically were driving our economy. And if we look back to 2014, before the changing government in 2015, we were investing in the oil and gas industry alone over $80 billion a year into the Canadian economy. And EPA members were building pipelines, they were building oil sands facilities, they were, across the economy. But the oil and gas industry was the largest investor into the Canadian economy at that point. It probably still is. And then we saw, as you said, anchor moratorium, carbon taxes, Bill C-69, and a suite of policy that drive that up to, for some years, it was around $20 billion. So a quarter. And our economy suffered. And in the last election, the Prime Minister committed to making Canada an energy superpower. I can tell you that is music to my ears, and I think to the energy industry. He also committed to making Canada the fastest growing economy in the G7. And I think that is impossible without the resource sector playing the dominant role, without the contractors which you represent building Canada. And it's an ambitious goal I think we can all get behind. That being said, it will take substantial change. We're not talking about tweaking Bill C-69. We're not talking about a carbon tax modification. When we look at where the investment around the world is going, it is going to countries that are very deliberate at pushing investment, being attractive. And Canada isn't close. We are a substantial distance from that on a policy front. We've got great resources. We've got fantastic technology and a workforce which is sophisticated. We got a problem with our policy. And to become an energy superpower, it's going to take a very different approach. And yes, the Prime Minister has a lot of baggage with his book and other things that he's said and done over the years. He's also got a cabinet that still has Stephen Guilbeault, a fairly radical environmental activist in a senior role. And putting forward bills like Bill C-5, which is designed to circumvent Bill C-69, is not going to solve our problem. It is not viewed by those that would need to make those investments as a solution. The anchor moratorium is not been repealed. The carbon tax is something that looks like for the average citizen has now been repealed, but there has been a commitment from the government to double down on industry, and that is what will grow our economy. That is what will get Canada competitive, is if we can make ourselves consistent with what our competitors have. And that around the world is largely no carbon tax. That seems like a bold statement, but it's the truth. So I think we're all keen to be the energy superpower, but we're getting increasingly frustrated that the policy changes that would need to be made are not being made. And putting a major project office together isn't new. We've had to make the project office in Canada before. That's not the problem, the lack of an office. It's those meaningful policy changes that are going to be hard for a Carney government to do, but are essential if Canada wants to be successful.
That's great feedback. I'm reminded, as you covered those topics, of a friendly debate that you and I had about the advisability, for example, of Canada building energy kind of corridors or super corridors. And I think, not to put words in your mouth, I recall you saying, well, it's a good idea, but the problem is the last mile. When you talked about the tanker super ban, here we have a Carney administration, I think to its credit at this juncture, talking about being an energy superpower, making Canada's economy more dynamic. And at least beginning to indicate that part of that mix is oil and gas. I mean, there's been nods towards nuclear, which is good. But if we don't fix the tanker ban issue in particular, just as an example, it's kind of like the last mile thing, or it's like the next mile, because if we can't access tidewater, notwithstanding, the Trans Mountain project success, is it really not a waste of time, but like, what are we doing here if we're not looking at a pervasive review of these policies rather than setting up a major project office to kind of wave a flag?
I think it's even worse than that, that the last mile is the tanker ban. The first mile is the emissions cap.
Yeah.
And right now, the shiny object is a pipeline. Is it a corridor? Is it a pipeline? That's essential for us to grow. But if we build 1 million barrel a day pipeline, let's just say the federal government did deep in their pocket and pays for it, and they clear all the hurdles to get it done. We now have 1 million barrel a day pipeline, but we need 1.5 million barrels of new production to come on to fill that pipeline. And the emissions cap us so we can't build this. And if you get it to the coast, you've got the tanker moratorium, so it can't go out. And the carbon tax is overarching and making Canada uncompetitive. So would you rather invest in an offshore in Guyana or an oil sands plant within Canada? The proof is in the pudding. And I think, just this past week, we saw one of our major oil sands producers announce major layoff and a restructuring that doesn't take us towards the superpower, it takes us away from it. And this is frustrating. I think let's not lose sight of the pipeline and its importance, but it is only one component in that broader picture.
That's so true. And one of the things that we're working on, Tim, is to I think this is probably an obvious thing for us to do, but we are securing a meeting with the major project office. And I think what's that license plate from Missouri? The Show Me state. So we're keeping an open mind to engage with the major project office as an instrument of Carney's intent. For all we know, that's going to be a robust office that is dynamic. But I think what I begin to hear from you, and it has been my own concern, is that unless we situate the major project office in terms of the suite of choices that are made to identify projects of national interest, so how those projects are identified, the problem begins to be you're picking winners, which means that you're also picking losers. And without putting words in your mouth, and I'm interviewing you, not the other way around, the concern that I have, Tim, is that wouldn't it make more sense rather than being a parade marshal for specific projects to be a parade marshal for the entire industry or industries and reduce the regulatory burden and fog so that these industries collectively can proceed. And with all the due acknowledgement of environmental and community acknowledgement, all those things are appropriate and they need to be in place. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head that we have become a planned economy, that the state has put in so many restrictions on production, on shipping, on the entire process. And then they come with Bill C5 to circumvent those rules on very specific projects, or a project office which then identifies. I think the oil and gas industry was one of the most free enterprise industries in Canada and in the world. And Canada has high environmental and regulatory and safety standards, and we should. But once that structure is in place, it should enable free enterprise to pick the winners and losers. It should allow investment to go to areas of highest value for the country, the company, and the investors. That is not what any of this model is. It is becoming increasingly the federal government will put their finger on what they want. They have all federal governments, or all governments have a track record of not picking the right winner or picking a highway to nowhere. We're going to have a pipeline to nowhere if we can't get the production on the other end of it. And I do not trust any government to pick which project is the right project. The complexities of that and the expertise of that are not in any government.
Tim, we've covered some of the big levers. Bill C-69, which is, in case our listeners don't know, is the Impact Assessment Act and the Canadian Energy Regulator Act. Those have been challenged by the then Jason Kenney administration and then Alberta court challenge, and it was upheld at the Supreme Court of Canada back in 23. You alluded to this earlier, but how has the government, at that time Trudeau and now Carney, how have they been able to avoid the declaration of the court in respect of Bill C-69?
Well, that's a particularly frustrating one because it was challenged by the provinces, and the provinces have been defending their right to develop natural resources. That's constitutionally guaranteed. The Supreme Court ruled in the province's favor. The federal government then amended the law in a way that in no way met the requirements of the Supreme Court, and it is again being challenged. I think this is a huge problem for Canada where a federal government has overstepped their bounds. The provinces are not subservient to the federal government. They both have responsibilities in the Constitution, and they have credit into the provinces. So the new amendments don't solve the problem. They are inconsistent with the Supreme Court, and we're having to work back through the court. This is the recipe for a failed state when the federal government ignores the court and uses the court to stall projects and stall the economy.
It strikes me that even while we talk about these, well, as I call them, the big levers, 69, the tanker ban, and these types of things, the carbon tax, there's also more, I'm going to call them granular, quite consequential, and certainly my cross-country pipeliner members will probably be familiar with this act, or at least the outframing of it, which is the Species at Risk Act. The pipeliners have to go through extraordinary endeavors, sometimes rightly so, to ensure that the environment through which they pass, the right-of-ways, protect not just both the flora and the fauna. Where is the Species at Risk Act kind of missing the boat, Tim?
Our firm has done substantial work looking at that act. It is a very challenging act for any development in Canada. And I'm not the expert on that in our firm, but the way the act is structured, the powers and where they're delineated, the ability for activists that just want to stall projects to intervene is so rampant that it is a challenge for, and not just oil and gas, we're talking about any resource development, any forestry, land use, mining. Again, it's the politics of changing that and fixing it are going to be a challenge. But if we aspire to the fastest growing economy in the G7, these are the fundamental pieces that need to be addressed. And I will clearly, if our current government and Prime Minister Carney will take this on to meet that goal he has set for.
Let's begin to wind it down a little bit, Tim. We've covered some good ground here. I think what I would maybe like to ask you to do is, as you've acknowledged earlier, we are a contractor association, construction companies who work all across the construction spectrum. We are now engaged in Ottawa. We have hired a full-time person to represent our interests in Ottawa. And do you have any kind of off-the-cuff suggestions, Tim, for how we would structure our policy asks with the federal government as we move forward, given the perspectives and comments that you provided?
Just maybe a couple general ones, some things that I've seen in the past, both when I was in government and then when I was working with the oil and gas industry. Often we negotiate with ourselves and we start to water down what we think is possible, even though we know it won't be adequate. I think Canada's potential is phenomenal. And I think the global demand for what we have is only increasing. We need to position ourselves. I think the Prime Minister's goals are appropriate. I am a huge supporter of those two goals. Mm-hmm. And to come forward with something that is watered down, politically palatable, that doesn't get our goals achieved, is not doing anyone a service. So being strong, doing what's right for Canada. And we can do that, and will do that in a way that's environmentally, socially, and safety responsible. But one example I'd give is the emission cap. That is clearly unconstitutional. The federal government dreamed it up and then put it out there. They're now using that as a bargaining chip to negotiate back against carbon tax, which also might be unconstitutional and not their responsibility for resource development. And, I see many groups and people falling into the trap of, well, let's raise the emissions cap. No, that at no point was that ever a legitimate role of the government to impose it, so don't let them use it as a bargaining chip. So that would be my advice is you guys are competent, you're experts, you have a very strong voice, and keep striving for what's right for Canada because your members are credible experts in this space.
That's great. Great counsel, Tim. Tim, where can our listeners find you if they want to learn more about your organization or interact with you in person?
So we're based out of Calgary. We do mainly resource-based work. We've got a website, garrisonstrategy.ca, and anybody that wants to chat, be happy to.
That's fantastic. Tim, thank you for giving us your time today. I really appreciate your perspectives, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Terrific. Well, thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks, Tim.